Equal access to justice is a core American value. In each episode of Talk Justice, an LSC podcast, we will explore ways to expand access to justice and illustrate why it is important to the legal community, businesses, government, and the general public. Talk Justice is sponsored by the Leaders Council of the Legal Services Corporation.
It really was a learning process for me. I had to learn to listen and shut up for once. And what I was learning was that there were these, what I call these non-credential forms of meaning that we in the front row just didn't consider. The value of faith, the value of hometown, the value of family, and we'll get to race in a second, but the value of these identities that you could have that you didn't have to have a resume for.
It's really my great pleasure to introduce Chris Arnaud to the program. I've been following Chris for a while and excited to have a little conversation with him. Chris is a freelance writer, he's a photographer, he's an author. He just came out fairly recently with the book Dignity. We've, I think, got a link to it in the webinar, and hopefully we'll put one on the Facebook page as well. Chris's work, his writings have appeared in the New York Times, in the Atlantic, the Guardian, the Post, the Financial Times, the Journal, and a bunch of others. He's got a PhD in physics from Johns Hopkins, and he worked for years as a trader at a Wall Street bank. But he left in 2012 to really catalog life in America, which led to his book. So Chris, I am delighted to have you here. So where are you calling in from today, Chris? Are you at home or are you traveling around the country?
I'm at home. Unfortunately, COVID has left me at home. I thought in honor of I was gonna do this from a parking lot of a McDonald's in honor of of my project.
I think you should have.
As you all know, that wouldn't have been a very reliable service. I thought sitting in my car, live streaming from my car in a parking lot of McDonald's would have been appropriate.
And we'll get to the McDonald's in a second, but I want to talk about an important distinction that you make, and really kind of much of the focus of your book is this distinction between so-called back row America and front row America. Could you tell us a little bit about what you mean by back row and front row America, and how we understand them as different?
Back row America is generally the people on the people you serve, the people that most of the people on this call serve. It's people who I use the schoolroom analogy because I think the biggest division, one of the biggest divisions in our country right now is education. It's a division we don't seem to really talk about. We talk about the other divisions, class and race, but I think education is a huge division, and so I use the schoolroom analogy of the back row as generally the people I spent the last 10 years with are people who are at the very back of the row, people who generally might have dropped out of high school, and if they did finish high school, they didn't go to college, and if they went to college, they usually went to a community college for a few years or something, or maybe a smaller state school. Whereas I contrast that with so many people who are both on this call, myself, and the people who generally make policy for our country, who generally have gone to a collection of maybe 15 institutions, college, have advanced degrees, and live in what I call front row neighborhoods, places that are, where people like them collect and have an outside influence on how this country is run and the policies that shape it. And I think that the difference between the two is the gulf is often so large that I think we have a trouble thinking about it in many cases.
Yeah, and your own trajectory shows a kind of a movement from kind of back row America in a small town in Florida to, front row America, PhD at Johns Hopkins, working at an elite Wall Street firm. But then you sort of go back to the back row in these walks that you took in Hunts Point. And if anybody knows New York, Hunts Point is not a place that you go because you want to see, the tourist sites. Hunts Point is a place you go because you have to go there. How did that journey that led really to the book Dignity begin with these walks in Hunts Point?
Originally, it began with just relieving stress. I would take these 20-mile walks, but I would bring my camera, and during that process of taking these walks through New York, I started meeting people who were attracted to me by my camera and wanted to tell me their stories. And what evolved basically was a recognition that I had kind of gotten to a point that I never thought I would get to, where I'd kind of forgotten my past and gotten to a point of privilege where I'd lost touch with all those things I used to think that I understood. The people I quote, I was making decisions about, people, I was literally sitting in front of a wall of computers making bets and opinions based on just numbers flashing across a screen without actually meeting the people that were impacted by these decisions. And during those walks, I was meeting the people impacted by those decisions. And so the walks eventually took me, as you said, to Hunts Point, which is probably, what's most jarring about Hunts Point is beyond the stereotypes that, is the fact that it's only 10, 15 minutes from Upper West Side. It's just such a different world, so close to a world, and the two worlds just are, just don't, as a lot of your listeners just don't, are very different.
And that experience in Hunts Point and that re-encounter with, I guess, your own past in a way, kind of led you to this 2-year journey across America. Not, as I like to say, not a journey of its landmarks and monuments, but of its poverty, of its poor neighborhoods, its poor people. And when did you kind of decide to kind of leave this Wall Street life behind and begin to really explore this side of America?
I spent basically, when I had walked into Hunts Point, I was really drawn in by a lot. A lot of it was a political issue, meaning that I was drawn in by the kind of injustice I saw and was very frustrated. And so I spent time trying to share what I saw with the wider public through my writings and my photography. And so I spent 3 years in Hunts Point, with the most back row. I don't want to use stigmatized terms, but I will use them. I spent time with heroin addicts in abandoned buildings and abandoned cars, under bridges, at some point I realized that what I saw, the injustices, and both the justices and also the beauty I saw in Hunts Point, the unrecognized beauty that I think doesn't get talked about enough. I wanted to see if that was also true elsewhere. Was this just something unique to Hunts Point, or was it a broader issue? And I realized that I was much happier there was this really absurd period in my life when I was doing this, but also working on Wall Street. And so my weekends were spent in drug traps, and my days were spent trading bonds. And I realized these two couldn't coexist, and I had to choose which one that quite honestly I felt better about doing, and it was the photography and the writing. And so I quit my Wall Street job and did that. And I had the luxury of having worked a long enough time on Wall Street that I could do that, which is, very few people have that ability, that privilege. And so I literally got in my van and put 200,000 miles on it, driving around the country, visiting communities that the people on this call know all too well that you serve.
And you in your discussion of kind of back row and front row, and you talked a little bit about education, but in the book you mentioned another of kind of distinguishing features that you see with back row America that makes it different than front row. One is faith and the importance of faith in their life. The second, I think, is a sense of place, their connection to their home and to where they live. And of course, race has a huge impact on what goes on in background America. And I suppose we could add the ubiquity, as you mentioned it, of drugs in that world. Can you talk about sort of the values of the back row that the front row often misunderstands or even, I guess, ridicules?
Yeah, what I try to communicate in my book is I call them non-credential forms of meaning, which means that we in the front row we recognize one kind of goal in life, and that's to build a resume. That's to get credentials and build a resume and be successful. And that's how we define ourselves. In the back row, in the places I was going, Portsmouth, Ohio, Hunts Point, El Paso, First Ward of El Paso, East LA. What I was seeing, and learning, and it really was a learning process for me. I had to learn to listen and shut up for once. And what I was learning was that there were these, what I call these non-credential forms of meaning that we in the front row just didn't consider. The value of faith, the value of hometown, the value of family, and we'll get to race in a second, but the value of these identities that you could have that you didn't have to have a resume for, and that these were things that were gifted to you at birth. And so in that sense, they were very non-elitist. They were, everybody has a family. Most everybody has a family. Most everybody has a hometown, a community, and most everybody can enter a church and be a welcome member. And those things you don't need a resume for. They're just they're forms of meaning that I think have lost sight of, And I'm not a I want to be I'm very careful to distinguish between having lost sight on and actively devalued. I think people in the front row are not bad players. I think they like me sitting behind a computer screen looking at numbers. Numbers don't they don't measure faith. They don't measure the value of faith. They don't measure the value of being a good member of your congregation or a good member of your community. They don't measure the value of staying in your hometown full life. They don't measure the value of being a good parent. And so I think we tend to devalue them only because we don't value them in the first place. We don't think of them as things that register as something that means something to somebody. And that can get into that can pivot into actual mocking of them, because if you don't see it as, in particular, I think the biggest one comes across as faith, where I think the front row is, the policymakers are more comfortable. Now, this was never me, but I mean, I counted myself as as an atheist at the time. I was surrounded by people who just looked at people who went to church, or people who lived their life for the church as somehow backwards. And I think, that's a sense of humiliation that hits home for a lot of people that can be very painful.
Yeah, I have to say my own experience. I worked for 3 years in a parish in rural Ohio, and I have to say my University of Chicago law degree meant nothing to them. The fact that I was there in the parish, that I was willing to help families, that I was committed to something, that meant a lot to them. And so I agree. It's a different value system in which the credentials that I'm used to, my big resume, just meant nothing to them. But that commitment to family and to faith and to the community meant a whole lot, and was really what defined you. One of the things I sort of want to talk about, we talked about a little bit at the beginning, 2 points of commonality in terms of places that you mentioned a lot. We talked a little bit about faith, so churches are important there, but also the McDonald's. In many ways, what your travels were, where it was a trip from one McDonald's to the next. I hope there's a reward program for the McDonald's, because you probably got a lot of that. And you point Back Row America gravitates to both. Can you talk a little bit about that? What is it about these that bring in that back row where they find a connection with, and what can sort of front row, especially service providing front row America, kind of learn from this?
The biggest, I'll address the McDonald's first, and I went there because that's where the people I was writing about went, and it was pretty. And once I opened my eyes and saw why they're there, it became pretty obvious. Which is, there's spaces that allow people to congregate for periods of time, and don't cost a lot, and provide simple services without a great sense of feeling judged. Meaning, you can buy good. They actually have good food. I count myself as someone who likes McDonald's food. And I say that ironically. But you can buy inexpensive food that's filling, and being in a space where you can use a restroom, you can use Wi-Fi, that's extraordinarily important. And then you often can you have charging outlets, and that's important for people who don't have access to these very basic, what are now basic needs. But also the most important thing was, in some senses, especially for the homeless that I was dealing with, and the people who were, involved in drugs at the time, was it was a place you could rejoin polite society and not be an outcast. You could just sit there and be a member. You could walk into the McDonald's, reach into the garbage can, grab out a newspaper or a cup, fill a soda cup, and sit in the corner and just be a member of society again, without being mocked or scolded or whatever. And that was really important. And and they work. I mean, and the other thing is and this is where I go back to the churches, is a lot of the spaces I spent time in, a lot of the neighborhoods I put time in, the only things that were open and functional, that were available to people were Wednesday nights, Saturday nights, Sunday services in churches, where the lights, as I say in my book, where the lights were on and they were warm, and you walked into the spaces and you felt like you were understood, and you weren't, like I always say, and I do this to my friends in academics. I said, look, I appreciate a lot of your goals in academics, but if a homeless person walks onto a college campus, the police are going to be called. If they walk, and they're not going to find people who are like them, who are not going to, they may be people who want to advocate for them, but they're not going to be people they understand. Where they walk into McDonald's or to a church, especially the more storefront churches, they're going to meet people who are like them, who look like them, behave like them, act like them. Especially, the employees at McDonald's are often people who have had rough past themselves. And so there's this connection there where they feel welcomed. And the lights are on, to put it in a kind of, and people are going to, people will laugh at me for saying this, but McDonald's and churches are places that provide nonprofits, and I love nonprofits and I love the work they do, but in many cases they can feel like they have no soul. They have linoleum floors, harsh fluorescent lighting, and they just feel like there's rules about everything. And the churches and the McDonald's are places that have, I'm not going to say McDonald's has soul, it has soul. There's a sense of like, a community there that really is kind of welcoming, that I think that works. And I think what people can learn, and the other one is just accessibility. They're accessible. And I think that's the biggest lesson I would say that to people who work in providing services is this is where the people want to be. This is the spaces they want to occupy. So go there rather than have them come to you.
Great. We're almost at the end time. So I do want to ask you just a couple last questions, and one that actually probably just one last question that I want to jump to. In your discussion of your time in Hunts Point, you talk about Takesha and her husband Steve, and when you ask her how she wants to be described, she says, quote, as who I am, a prostitute, a mother of 6, and a child of God. I was really moved by that. And I think that seems to sum up more than anything kind of the message of dignity. How can we in the front row who may struggle with Takesha's life decisions, as it were, understand that she deserves dignity and make sure to treat her with dignity?
Yeah, I mean, that quote struck me 8 years ago, and it will never leave me, and Takesha will never leave me. But I mean, it's treat people as individuals. Treat them as give them the full benefit of being fully rounded people, both in a good way and a bad way. You don't have to, you don't have to like everybody you meet who's homeless. Some of them you don't like, but that they really are. They are, everybody's equally valid, and people have gotten into these positions through complex stories that you don't necessarily know when you first meet them. And there's a lot more to people than just the stereotypes we attach to them.
Yeah, as one thing I've learned as a priest is that people's stories are much more complex than we understand.
That's correct.
Almost all the time. Chris, I wish I had another hour of conversation with you. I loved your book. I love following you on Twitter. I do say anybody who wants to see the beauty of Back Row America is please see Chris's photography of Back Row America. You really see the beauty of these people and the places in which they inhabit. And I think it's essential for us who serve these people to understand that beauty. Chris, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Father.
Podcast guest speakers' views, thoughts, and opinions are solely their own and do not necessarily represent the Legal Services Corporation's views, thoughts, or opinions. The information and guidance discussed in this podcast are provided for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice. You should not make decisions based on the podcast content without seeking legal or other professional advice.